I'm going to speak a little bit about issues of sex and romance, and admittedly, given the reduced time we have for this unit this semester, I won't be saying a whole lot about it, but there's a few things I wanted to offer and share regarding sex and romance, and actually one of them not even specific to that. Right? So one of the things I want to be sure to talk about is something called the male deficit model. And I want to emphasize the male deficit model is a bad thing. So male deficit model is, it's one of these. It's not a good thing. And that is, the male deficit model is something that we see happening. It's not really in the literature per se, but it's something that we see happening, and I see a lot of it in media, and I hear people talk about it. And it's the assumption we have that men, male, right, the male there, right, is deficient in some way. Can you hear I have a helper in the room with me? I do. He's short but sweet. Okay, so it has to do with questions about who do we think is relationally wise? You think about that, about wisdom, right? Really knowing what good choices are, right? Who knows the proper way that you express love? Who's responsible for the relationship, for making sure it's in good shape and taking care of it? So often, and culturally, we speak as though men are really deficient in all of these ways. That they have no wisdom about relationships, they don't know how to express love, and that they're not really responsible for the health and well-being of relationships, right? And you see a lot of this, and it's sort of from top to bottom about he doesn't know any better, and she's going to have to show him, and she's going to have to teach him, and he just doesn't know he hasn't figured out yet what to do to make her happy. And you see a lot of this in bad sitcoms and things. It's the male deficit model. It's just, again, it assumes that men don't know how to do these things, as opposed to saying, if anything, it's a big if, there may be differences in how women and men do relationships, potentially. Although the research on that is sort of, not real solid, but not non-existent, right? It's not that it's non-existent, but it's not as solid. It's changed. We're seeing generational changes. But we get this male deficit model many times when we talk about heterosexual relationships. To be clear about that, heterosexual relationships, assuming that men don't really know how to do relationships or express love or care for relationships, when it may be that men just do it in a way different than women do. Maybe. Or they do it the same way. But still, the assumption is, many times you see this in culture, that men just don't understand relationships and women do, and so women have to show them the way. So it sort of hurts everybody. On the one hand, it dismisses men and calls them ignorant, and it also makes women responsible for the relationship and for teaching him, her sort of deficient little man. Right? So in terms of how do we express love, sometimes people express love by showing and some express love by telling. The research isn't really solid, and there being as strict a gender difference in these as we used to say or think there were. We're starting to loosen up on this some. But the idea is that people express intimacy through one of two ways. One of those is through talking, right? So it's intimacy through dialogue, and the other is intimacy through doing, or instrumental behavior. If you're more prone to one of these than the other, you might get a sense of that by the question I'm about to ask. If I ask you, who is the person you're closest to? Let me say it. Who's your closest friend? I don't want to include family. Who's your closest friend? And then I say, well, how do you know they're your close friend? What do you say? Do you say, that's the person I know I can tell everything to and tells everything to me? Or do you say, that's the person who will do anything for me and I'll always be there to do anything for them? Like, they need something, just pick up the phone and call me, I'll be right there. Right? That's dialogue versus instrumental. And and it used to be said when we taught gender, myself being one of those people, having taught this class for over 15 years, we used to say that women were more prone to intimacy through dialogue and men through instrumental behavior. Now we're recognizing it more as thinking of intimacy through talk as being a feminine characteristic, and intimacy through doing, or this instrumental behavior, as being perhaps a masculine characteristic. So we've sort of eased up on that. But this is one of the things that we see when we're talking about relationships and gender is that. And what's important there, going back to the male deficit model, is that even if men and women do express love for each other in different ways, they're both equally valid. Right? That's one of the key takeaways there. So I don't want to get a whole lot into men be like and you how women are, but just to talk about when there may seem to be differences, how we can reframe that as just being a cultural difference, perhaps at most, and not being about a deficiency. So when speaking of sexuality, who was speaking of sexuality? I was. Okay. So when speaking of sexuality, one of the things that we see is that heterosexual couples generally seem to conform to pretty traditional scripts, right, in terms of men and women in their relationship. Things like who initiates the relationship, if they're going to get to the stage of some sort of commitment like marriage, who's going to propose, as we say, right? Heterosexual couples have a tendency to do the pretty traditional thing. And again, like I said, initiation, like asking for a first date, and the structures within those relationships, right? So we're thinking about domestic responsibilities, those sorts of things, pretty traditional. In same-sex relationships, the model is described by the researchers as being much more like best friends plus sex and romance, right? So that's what the relationships look more like, is a friendship with sex and romance, as opposed. So basically, the relationships are seen as being more egalitarian. Every lecture almost seems like today has that word, right? More egalitarian than complementarian, right? So more sort of the same than being, some sort of complement or balance of each other, right? And in terms of having sex, compared to heterosexuals, not making them a standard, but just saying as a point of comparison, lesbians tend to wait longer for the first sexual interactions, and gay men seem to wait less time. And so the common denominators we're seeing there is the presence of men accelerating that sexual relationship. And if you go way back to the first lecture of this course when I was talking about the similarity hypothesis, you may recall the one difference that did show among, or one of the, other than like physical strength, the difference that showed among women and men had to do with issues of sexuality, and men being less likely, or being more comfortable with what otherwise would be seen as promiscuous behaviors, right? Multiple partners and so forth, being pretty comfortable with that, and women being less so. And that itself, I don't know how much that's really in the brain. I suspect a lot of that has to do with culture and how many of us have been socialized. Regardless, that pattern that we talked about way back in the beginning of men being accepting of sexual expressions from masturbation to promiscuity more so than women, we see some of that being played out here. We're talking about when is that sex is initiated in these relationships. So as we continue speaking about sex, I want to talk about, within heterosexual relationships, the role of contraception. There is some research on this, and the pattern is sort of predictable. There's something nice to it, but it's sort of problematic. You'll see what I mean here. So when talking to men about their understanding of contraception in their sexually active relationships, they see it as largely being the woman's responsibility, or women's responsibility. And it's seen as her obligation, largely because it mostly impacts her. So it's her responsibility because it's an obligation, it's a thing she's going to be doing, because, and these are really, we're talking to younger folks, so for him, vasectomy isn't really an option that's feasible or makes much sense here. And the only other option for him is condoms, and we see men having a real reluctance to use condoms, and so instead, birth control then becomes her obligation, so he doesn't have to use condoms. That's the first thing that happens, the responsibility shifts to her because he doesn't want to have to use condoms. And then it is seen that contraception most impacts her because the greatest concern we see among young people with the use of sexual protection is about contraception rather than preventing STDs, which is a whole thing I really can't get into right now, but that's a thing, right? And so men report being very supportive of the woman's decision, saying, one of the men interviewed said, after the lady and like at the health department reviewed all the options, I thought we should do the one that had the lowest rates of pregnancy. But I said, it's your choice because it has to go into your body, right? Whether that's going to be an injection, an implant, a ring, like one that goes up near the cervix, a pill, understanding it's going to be her body. And so the men were then very supportive of like, listen, this is your body, so you need to make the best choice, right? And they saw that this was consistent across class and racial lines, that the men, were really supportive of women. Actually, in the study, the part of the study I was looking at was saying they were looking to see about issues of class and race. They found it was consistent with what we've seen of white middle class kids. We were seeing among Latinx and black kids. I say they're young adults, I should say, right? But one thing that happened also is that in the study they were saying that there was a tendency then, because it was the woman's obligation, if there was a failure, as we say, a pregnancy, the woman was to blame. That she somehow was not responsible, that he felt that she had fallen down in her obligation. So this is one of the tricky parts here, is that he really supports her in her decision, so she's got to manage the thing, and if it doesn't work, it's her fault. Right? So that's the thing we have going on here. And so this very pattern of familiar roles in which women are responsible for the couple, for the unit, for these more domestic, familial things, even not thinking about having a family. She's responsible for them in a way that he is not. And so, and as I said, the nice part is the men were supportive of the women, but it didn't take away from the fact that they were still putting that pressure and responsibility on the women.